From WBRN Radio in Boston and on the Boston Red Network, our episode, Thanksgiving Day 2017. We think of Thanksgiving Day as a family holiday. It is the most traveled holiday of the holidays we celebrate here in America. People going to visit their relatives, close acquaintances, family, dinners, talking over food, etc. And the talking over food involves the current issues of the day many times. We have an article, and a very interesting article from the Washington Post about an aunt that visits her family in Trump country, Ohio. She is a liberal, and they were assuming she would not show up. She evidently was late. That's the kind of story that occurs at many dinner tables. I can recall the late, great Jerry Pippin talking about a dinner he attended with his sister, and various people appeared there, the sister's husband, and he happened to have on a Barack Obama t-shirt. Now, this is in Very Red, Oklahoma, where the dinner was, and there was almost a fight at the table. But it was averted, and the people, as they say, sort of simmered down, and tempers did not, as they say, get too far out of hand. But this happens many times, that there are arguments over religion, there are arguments over various things in the lives of the people that are assembled there for the collective good. It is not a time that people boast about what they have. It does happen, but it's about what we have, the collective we. And the first Thanksgiving, although it was fictionalized, that the Aboriginal and Native Americans had a celebration with some of the trespassers on their land. We'll call them trespassers. They call themselves whatever, on Plymouth Rock. People that arrived here from Europe. But the problem is the way the history was written, it was like these people arrived from what was civilization, and they found the savages here. But the so-called savages that were here already had very sophisticated units of government, as the Iroquois Nation, etc., and various other nations across this vast continent. And it was a vast continent that all of these so-called Puritan types had never seen. They were on the East Coast. They had never seen the West at that time. They didn't even understand the full length of this country from the East Coast to the West Coast. They were in New England, and that was where they settled. And later they moved on as far as the gateway to the West, which at the time was called St. Louis, and on then the Oregon Trail to the far West. And then we started to put together a mosaic called the 50 individual states. Now, they had not got to Alaska at the time, nor to Hawaii, which was obviously thousands of miles away. No one would have envisioned that particular situation. But back to the celebration. In many cultures, you have celebrations for many different things. And this was a celebration that was carried on. Hence, we came in with the sound of the turkey. Now, there are people out here, like myself, that had fish, or having fish, and not necessarily turkey or whatever else they put in. That's from the Turkey Association. There was a turkey pardon at the DJ Trump office in Washington, D.C., but yet DJ Trump would pardon a turkey. He's pardoned a few other people. Of course, he's saving those pardons up depending on what happens down at the D.C. criminal courts. Probably will use some of those pardons, pardon slips or whatever we'll call them, that are there. But what we want to do in this program, we'll look at the aunt in Ohio, but we'll also look at the amount of time for disability claims. This is Social Security disability. Way over 500 days, 600 days. And a person that is filing, no matter what the disability is, they're going to be denied and go to appeals and denied, and they cannot work during this period. So what are they supposed to do to just merely survive? And these are people that have severe illnesses, that have been injured on the job, physically, psychologically, and of course the economic and social stigmas that go with it. One example that the Washington Post has is of a man in his mid-50s in Mississippi, of all places, deepest, darkest Mississippi, that he had to fall back upon his mother to drive him around, etc., to the Social Security office or to the attorney that is representing him. The way this works is the attorneys are paid on a set fee that they garner, but the success rate is very low. We'll get to that in a minute. And these are some of the stories that we put together for this 2017 Thanksgiving Day, that it is beyond what they call a Thanksgiving. It is a celebration of the American community via a few families or individuals or community celebrations, citizens acting to help other citizens out of via charitable organizations. But it's also a very political day. That's why the turkey was pardoned at the White House, that people reflect on what is happening around them. And you cannot isolate yourself from what is happening around them, no matter how much happy talk at the table, the family table, or at a restaurant, or at a shopping center, a cinema, and the night before now is known as, Blackout Wednesday or whatever, where people are out and about and drinking the day before. And then, of course, we have the Super Shopping Day on a Friday known as Black Friday. I'm not sure why they didn't name it White Friday, but nonetheless, and it goes through the weekend. And then, of course, we have Cyber Monday in some places where they're promoting local businesses. You have the Friday event, and then you have local shopping on Saturday. And then there are subdivisions of this out there. So all of these things are going on. It started a mercantile event also for the retail sector. Many of the retail, quote-unquote, establishments, the Sears of the world, the Macy's, have closed stores right and left. So that sector is beginning to be a different sector. Now that you have online shopping, you can simply shop from wherever, your home, a bus, mobile shopping. You can select whatever you need. The Targets of the world, I believe, have one day that they will designate for 15% off in the store. They've looked at certain times during this holiday season. People are not in the stores. If you recall, very long lines in previous years with the big screen TVs out there, 50 plus inches in the U.S. I'm not sure how many centimeters it is for our other listeners, but nonetheless, these large TVs, they have now turned into 62 or 65, whatever. And it was pointed out in one article that I read, and we know this, from selling of monitors, etc., for computers and various other things, that say Samsung, for instance, will have a certain TV. By definition, now it's a picture in a picture and whatever else they're doing, but they will have several of these televisions, maybe 10 different models, and other competitors use different components. So now you're told to go to the store, turn it up, and see if it's rattling inside or whatever the situation is. And of course, you have your short warranties. Many things I'm talking to a lady that worked at a Walmart store, that many of the items, and this is just during the normal business, are returned to the store. And obviously during the holiday season there always were returns, particularly for clothing and those sorts of things. But now it's more for electronics, because people are not getting what they want. In other words, these what used to be called lost leaders are not lost leaders. They're not lost. They may be leaders, but they are very, very deceptive in terms of your components. Thus, you need to look at things like the Consumer Reports, various other reviews, and more than one review to see what is there, and then actually look at the TV with your own eyes and turn up the volume. If you have a bunch of rattling there, you know what you're getting. And then move on to the next TV set of the next store or whatever. Anyway, this is just a little bit of consumer advice, not wanting people to turn up, convey, and tour here. Now on to our set. We pretty much are going, well, we'll close with this, American Grace. This is published in the People's World, and I guess it's part of our setup here, where we'll start... period. This is from the Post. The Pilgrims gave thanks for change in a climate, but didn't thrive until they changed too. This is from the Post by Sam White. Every American school child learns a version of the first Thanksgiving. We went through it. The Pilgrims spent a frozen first winter in Plymouth. We know where that is, in New England. Friendly Aboriginals and natives helped them learn to harvest the bounty of their new country. The next year, as Edward Winslow wrote in a letter late in the in the autumn of 1621, many of the Aboriginals coming amongst us, we entertained and feast. So they had a feast there. This story gets more interesting when we look at the first mention of an actual Thanksgiving at Plymouth. Less than 2 years after the 1621 feast, the colonies faced drought, famine, and in this personal history of the colonies, William Branford, you would heard about him, or at least you used to, described how the English declared a day of repentance and prayers. Then God sent them a sudden rain, both to their own and the natives' admiration. Anyway, we'll skip all that. We could write this off just as a curious anecdote if it weren't for a dozen other accounts of similar episodes in the early colonies. By the time the Pilgrims came to New England, Europeans had been trying to settle North America for more than a century. It's 100 years. First, the Spanish expeditions to the south and southwest produced tales like Bradford's, as did the colonists in the Carolinas and Virginia, missionaries in Spanish Florida, the French in Canada. In many cases, they reported Aboriginals asking them to pray for better weather, to intercede with that Christian God they talked so much about, if the natives' gods weren't up to the task. We should take the stories with a grain of salt, but there is often evidence that something unusual was going on during many of these early encounters. Advances in paleoclimatology, the science of reconstructing past climates from records such as tree rings, and we did the schoolboy simple here, lake sediments show how America in the late 1500s and early 1600s were getting cooler and more prone to drought. The trend was part of a global pattern some call the Little Ice Age. The causes were complex, but the effects were unmistakable. And the way the Pilgrims copied and failed to cope with the shocks of new and harsh climates could serve as a warning to us. We face rapid changing environments. Narrow growth range in nearby stands of trees indicated that each story of supposedly miraculous rain prayers really did take place during the droughts. Many European expeditions happened to arrive during exceptionally bad years of frozen winter and parched summers between 1540 and 1541. For example, followers of de Soto, Hernando de Soto reported snowstorms in Arkansas, Alabama. Followers of Colorado rode horses over the frozen Rio Grande. The first Spaniards explorers in California found mountains of the Monterey Bay covered in snow. The first English colonies of Roanoke and Jamestown starved during the region's worst droughts in centuries. From the early explorers and colonists, the Little Ice Age was only half of the problem. The English, French, and Spanish experienced climate shock in another sense when they crossed the Atlantic. Prevailing waterly winds at mid-latitudes meant that the air passages over the ocean into Europe, producing a milder maritime climate compared with the variable seasons of North America, where air passages over the continental interior. Europeans of the era imagined that the climate would be more or less the same as along the same latitudes, meaning Virginia would have the seasons of Sicily and New England, those of northern France. Colonists thus tried and failed to cultivate tropical fruits in Virginia, silkworms in Maine. It took decades of disease for Americans' climate reality to sink in. By the Little Ice Age, the standard for the Pilgrims' first winter at Plymouth wasn't especially cold. The droughts of 1623 wasn't exceptionally bad, but neither were the troubles over. A decade later, 2 years of severe droughts followed a destructive storm, brought a famine. Desperate to seize food and land, Massachusetts settlers, the Commonwealth, launched a war against a neighboring Pequot Indians in 1636. The Pequot, I hope I pronounced it right, now have casinos, massacring hundreds of men, women, and children in the region's worst colonial conflict. And they almost wiped out the tribe. I think the tribe was down to less than 50, and the last I heard, the Pequot have about 100 members on their range and on their rolls, and no other than in Connecticut, no other than DJ Trump himself tried to stop them from bringing about this casino, but the casino is there. They have put together centers. They have redone their language to a written language because now they generate millions of dollars. They gave thanks permanently. It turned out that once it looked like the worst seasons have passed, but the colonists didn't really thrive until they themselves changed by adopting to New England's climate and learning to raise crop and livestock in a way that could be supported in the region. Let me finish this up. By the way, the Pilgrims have left a more compelling story of a modern national holiday that is questionably tales of Anglo Aboriginal or Indian friendships that we teach our our children, but that's not the whole story. One more relevant to the present day. In late November, we can look forward to the weather cooling down across America, and some of us, possibly not those in Houston or Puerto Rico, can perhaps begin to forget about the record heat waves, hurricanes, floods the past months. Most of us can give thanks that we made it through another summer. Climate shock used to be we made it through a winter. The climate fluctuations of the little ice age were only fluctuations in the climate change project under most global warming scenarios. We can let the reprieve of fall and winter turn our attention away from the climate realities ahead and the need to adopt, even as we give so-called thanks for gentler weather now. That's a very interesting tale there of climate change. They had climate change. They had to make adaptations to it. It's interesting. A book, was it Guns, Butter, and whatever? Had, of course, a number of things there, the climate and just being lucky, period. Let me move on here. This is about the aunt, when your liberal aunt shows up at Thanksgiving in Trump country. Now, this is by Gary Abernathy. Another Thanksgiving, another season of bracing for dinner time conversations with your favorite right-wing uncle. Or so the shop worms liberal troop would have it. Let's pause to liberal, imagine the other half of the story, which is the media sometimes manages to overlook. This is Hillsboro, Ohio. The aroma of turkey from the kitchen is aunts, uncles, nieces, nephews, cousins, their various spouses spread out on the couch and chairs inside an old southern Ohio farmhouse, admiring the 13-point buck mounted on the wall, reminiscing about cousin Johnny's bagged it when he was only 10 years old. The room is filled with chatter, laughter, large enough to drown out the sounds of kids playing in the back room. Outside, an assortment of pickup trucks, gun racks, couple of SUVs, oversized tires parked there. Awkwardly around the big yard, several bumper stickers. He won't get over it. Trump 2020. Deplorables for Trump. Build a wall, enforce the law. God-fearing, Bible-believing, gun-packing, America-loving. It was almost noon when Uncle Joe leaned over to cousin Danny and asked, "Do you think she'll show up?" A hush descended upon the room. After a second, Danny replied, "Who knows? Every year she says she won't come, but she does anyway." Dinner on, grandmother hollers, and the adults march into the big dining room while the kids run to their seats at a small folding table nearby. Grandpa says grace. Grandmother orders, "Bow your head. Dear Lord, we thank you for this day, and we ask." Grandpa is all of a sudden interrupted by the front door banging open. "I made it," shout Aunt Louise. "Traffic on the interstate was horrible, but I'm here." Uncle Joe exchanged a look with cousin Danny. Louise tossed her coat on a chair in the corner and squeezed into a seat between Aunt Katie and cousin Johnny. "We were saying the blessing," said Grandma. "Go ahead, Grandma." Grandpa cleared his throat. We thankful for our family and asked for blessings of the food and hands prepared there. Anyway, amen, and a few more voices. Everyone starts digging in to the plates and bowls clicking as they passed around the big oak table. "So, Louise, you still living in Chicago?" cousin Johnny asked. Love it, said Louise, her fork stabbing at a plate filled with salad and vegetable sides, but suddenly avoiding the turkey. Oh, Grandma said, I hope you don't mind. I plugged my Volt into the outlet on the patio. That's fine, Grandma replied, shooting Uncle Joe a look that warned him to keep quiet. Joe looked out the window at Louise's car with a sticker on it, Deport Trump, Keep Immigrants. Hey, Louise, this is something else. Ain't been shot yet, living in Chicago and all. Cousin Johnny said, Chicago is as safe as anywhere, said Louise, safer than walking around these parts during a deer season. Well, if Hillary had won, she probably would outlaw the deer season, Cousin Johnny said. Hillary did win by 3 million votes, said Louise, sipping from a bottle of water that she had tucked in her purse. She should be president. You wouldn't be saying that if the situation was reversed, Cousin Danny said. Uncle Joe couldn't help himself. What they need in Chicago is a law that would make everybody carry a gun. He said wouldn't have all the shootings if the criminals knew everybody was packing. That's right, several voices chimed in. Seriously, Joe, grandmother must drop you on your head when you were little, said Louise. Truly, grandmother, go behave. It's Thanksgiving. The discussion gradually turned to the kids, doctor's visits, and how bad the coming winter might be. After dessert, homemade pumpkin pie, chocolate cake, and another hour of small talk. Louise said, I have to head back. Long drive to Chicago. They said it might be snow. Don't rush off, grandmother. Grandma pleaded. You just got here. But Louise gathered her coat, hugged Grandma and Grandpa, kissed the kids. Joe walked her to the door. Hey, Louise, he said. As they stopped outside, Louise turned, bracing for him for a patting shot, but Joe said softly, we love you. Interesting. Joe noticed that Louise blinked against the cold. She smiled and walked back to the door, giving Joe a hug and a peek on the cheek. I love you too, she said, as she unplugged the cord to her Chevrolet Volk. Anyway, she added, I'll see you next Thanksgiving. Okay, Joe said, but Christmas is just next month. Louise smiled and said, we'll see. And Joe rejoined the family, and they chuckled about their crazy Chicago relative. They loudly agreed on how misguided she is, as they quietly reflected on how much they missed her. Very interesting, Mr. Abernathy's very interesting article here. And, well, let's just do this one. This is from the People's World. It's called American Grace on November the 23rd. Remembering those who grew the food. We picked, we packed, who shipped and sold. Bronze, Rainbow Arms have set the food upon our table. Remember those who built this house, assembled, weaved, created light and warm health. Remember those who fought and died to break the king's command, the slave's yoke, and slay the Nazi beast. Remember those who walked in darkness, eyes on the tears of the Trail of Tears. Marching in Selma, martyred in Memphis. They can't kill the dream. Jesus Yamada. Che on his cross in the Amazon highlands. Shots in the stadium. Pushed from the aeroplane. Martyrs for freedom and America. Never forget our ancient foe. his craft and his power, his endless thirst, though the blood and oil for prophets, uber allies. Remember those songs of love, restore still, Pueblo, Diego, Woody, Giant Paul. Mustn't keep on fighting, comrades all. Remember those who groove as food, who minced and forgot, who sung and loved, who fought and died, who made all the wealth at home and glory. All power and peace be unto you, be unto you. This was a poem and prayer originally published in March of 2006 in the People's World. Let me get to the disability claim here somewhere. We'll find it. This is a very, very sad story. 597 days. We'll summarize. We won't read it all. And still waiting. 10,000 people died in the past year while stuck in a backlog of judges' disability cases. This is what will happen to Joe Stewart. And this is a fellow that they on here. This is in Webster County, Mississippi, on day 597, the day he hoped everything would change. Joe Stewart woke early, took 15 pills in a single swallow, shaved his head, and then got down to the business of the day, which was a business of every day that was waiting. He looked out and saw his mother there in a green sedan, engine running. So many months had he waited for this moment, and now it was here. Stewart is 55, set out his crutches, toddling out of the mobile home down a metal ramp that he laid when the stairs became too much. I'm sweating my ass off, he said, getting into his mother's car, his long shivered shirt hanging open, a long-sleeved shirt, excuse me. He tilted the passenger seat all the way down, placed a pillow at the small of his back problems evidently. Did they say long-sleeved? Asked his mother. His mother is Jean Bingham. She's 73 years old. And it was only a decent shirt, only decent shirt I have, he said. He knew only what had been told by his lawyer, and he wanted to see him again before the hearing, and was not to wear a T-shirt, bringing a long list of medications he uses to treat the pain that are all he has to show for a lifetime of spent installing vinyl siding in Webster County. So he's got various things for depression, he's got various things for pain, and he's got something also for anxiety. His first appeal for the disability was in 2015. The application was denied, and so was his appeal. When he appealed the second time, rejected, he went on to the back of one of the federal government's biggest backlogs, 1.1 million disability claims wait for some 1,600 administrative law judges to decide whether they deserve a monthly payment or and a Medicare or Medicaid. A death sentence is how Stewart, who has no health insurance, has come to think of another denial. For other applicants, the wait itself may be enough to accomplish that. In 2 years, 18,701 people have died waiting for a decision, increasingly 15% of 8,666 deaths in fiscal year 2016 to 10,002 deaths in fiscal 2017, which we're in. The rising death toll coincides with a surge in the length of time people must wait for a deposition, which swelled from a national average of 353 days in 2012 to roughly 596 days now. The simple explanation is there's not enough money. The Social Security Administration budget has been roughly stagnant since 2010. That's 7 years. While the number of people receiving retirement disability benefits has risen by 7 million despite a slight decline in disability rolls beginning in 2015, excuse me, as some beneficiaries reach a retirement age. The more complicated explanation, however, is that it includes fewer supporting staff, no doubt about that, members helping judge a recession that has increased the number of applicants and appeals, a new regulation that requires additional medical evidence, lengthening the files judges have to read, and heightened scrutiny of in the aftermath of 2011 scandal in Huntington, West Virginia, where one judge was taking bribes and later convicted of taking $600,000 in bribes. But that in itself doesn't mean much about that. A poor steward here, he has to, as they say, maintain. He hangs up, shakes his head, unable to handle the shame of it anymore. He has promised himself that if he's denied, he will no longer accept his mother's assistance. She's been assisting him. He'll let his pills run out, his trailer go dark, and start drinking again. I don't know what he's going to use to drink with, but that is about it. In other words, he's out of money, out of luck. Sad story. The Hugh Gibson law firm, this is the one we talked about. This is Samantha. Can I help you? The receptionist is saying to another caller on the other side of the counter, sets a thin custom couch in the waiting room. Was a thin man with gaunt features, no doubt. Gibson Law, the receptionist said to another caller a few minutes later. Gibson, the most prolific Social Security disability lawyer in Whipson County, a tall man of 71 years, who himself walks with a limp and a cane, oh boy, came into the waiting room, glanced at the man on the couch, and headed into the back of the office. Gibson has spent years witnessing the disintegration of people like him, marooned in the disability adjudication system. He started taking disability cases 4 decades ago, 40 years, a long time. When claims in Webster County predominantly involved illness and car accidents. When potential claimants now asked about applying for disability, Gibson tells them that it could take a minimum of 2 years before a judge gets a decision, and that they can't work. That's scandalous. Does he have a good case? Gibson asked the assistant. He hasn't been to the doctor but twice this year, she says. A semi-idiot, then Gibson sighs, acknowledging that the severity of a medical condition matters only so much as what is documented. Yeah. So where does the disability payments go if you qualify for federal supplemental disability insurance? SSDI, your payments are determined by a complex formula drawn from a number of factors about your work experience, including income and age. By the nature of the formula, you always receive less than you earned on the average over the years you worked. In some cases, much less. In other cases, up to 90% of what you have. SSDF. I'm sorry, not SSI. That's another program. Gibson knows how terrible he must sound sometimes, hollering at clients, etc. Doesn't do any good. Outside of Gibson's office, Stewart, this is the guy we start out, held a stack of medical papers, disoriented, trying to listen to his mother ask question after question. Are you talking about those in there? She asked. How long is it going to take? Are you going to be okay? Anyway, remind me to tie my shoes. So in other words, this is a little dialogue going on here. Make no mistake, if you don't do this, well, you are going to lose. This is when he actually appears before a judge. Lord mercy, Gibson says, telling Stewart that he could not have drawn a stricter judge there in Judge James Profo. Oh boy. During the period, Profo decided 2,610 cases, approving only 27%, less than 30% of the total cases. Later, Stewart would get angry. He would think about all the people he had seen in Webster County receiving benefits whose disability he considered milder than his. Well, had different judges. You have a slim shot, he said, of people sitting around in the house watching TV all day. They are not used to talking, I understand that, but I have to get you to talk, to tell the judge the things the judge needs to know. Can you do that, Joe? And then Stewart was back in the car. He was rummaging for his anxiety medication. Didn't help his anxiety at all. And that is it. One hearing, how condensed to so many years of physical deterioration, so many days of waiting into one hearing. And yeah, that's it. The pills have taken, the number of pounds he can lift, etc., not very much at all. Stewart did his best to follow Gibson's directions. He carried his pillow with him, all those sorts of things. He showed pain. He said the burning in his chest. I went to see my chiropractor, but he wanted $60, which he didn't have. Not sure. I think the only money that the poor fellow is getting, another Social Security Administration building in a Tupelo, the part of the government policy, to work down the backlog by holding some disability hearings by video conference, the same thing they do for prisoners. And an hour had passed, and the end of the hearing was over. Gibson was saying, "Thank you, Your Honor." Stewart feeling dizzy and unsure where he is actually. Really, one lawyer, a good lawyer, they have 13 cases with him, and he didn't win one, not one. So in other words, he had 13 cases. They all were denied, but Mr. Gibson did get his hourly under the arrangement with the Social Security people. Gibson said something about errands he had to run. Took Stewart's hand and got into his big red truck. Shook. And it's caught another backlog of people awaiting depositions, which have doubled from last year, 35,000 claimants to 75. It's interesting how these end all in whole numbers. Anyway, watched him drive off, then saw his mother. She was in the car waving at him to move it. Yeah. Anyway, I can ask you a question, said his mother, who sat outside the courtroom, but overheard something from the video conference. And it ends here. Ain't over, he responded. There's nothing else to say they went to Webster County through the endless rows of tall pine trees, etc. He took his afternoon medication and back to his lounge. It's day 597 was over. The only thing left for him to do is wait for 598. Don Keating contributed to the report. This is a very sad situation that Mr. Stewart is not, as they say, in the Thanksgiving spirit. Experience, I should say. The Post says data on a Social Security disability is just plain wrong. Oh, well, anyway, you get into all that. Well, we got into a lot of this. The sidebar to the article, Social Security Administration. Every working person who receives benefits through supplemental income, that's SSI. The Social Security Disability Insurance, but the Social Security Administration doesn't publish the data needed for that calculation. The Center for American Progress also reached out to the Post to ask about their data. The Post confirmed in an exchange that they did indeed rely on public available data and identify specific reports, tables, and figures. So there was an analysis going on here. SSI doesn't publish county level data, beneficiaries, age range, etc. The 8,909,430 disabled workers, SSDI benefits, whose tables break down by county to 472,000. The overcount is about 750,000. About 1 million SSDI benefits are disabled adult children. Now, that's a little different situation there. As they further break this down, it can't accurately adjust for double counting the 1.3 million working age people who receive both. Now, that can happen, to receive both SSDI and SSI concurring benefits. That's for certain people there with low incomes and limited resources. Now, that can happen, and also people are allowed to work during these periods. So there are exceptions. And the Treasury Secretary, Mulvaney, opened the door, I think that's his name, to cut Social Security disability insurance despite Trump's pledge not to. So in other words, they are doing all kinds of things, machinations, period. Trump's plan for Medicaid would would de-centimate, this is part of the safety net here, just looking at it, people with disabilities. Congressional Republicans, career first throw towards this is the Affordable Care Act. Most Americans see, and we've talked about Medicaid here before, as the only health care program. Now, this is Medicaid, not Medicare. That people get a block grant will not adjust to rising needs, no doubt about that. So this is part of it. There's a huge racial gap in surgical cancer deaths. Repealing would make it much harder. So basically, we not only that, we're faced with racial discrimination here. Low-income patients with diabetes are 10 times more likely to undergo a limb amputations than affluent ones. African American women are 41% more likely than European women to die from breast cancer. Even African Americans are more likely to have elevated blood pressure than European Americans. They are 10% more likely to be screened, less likely, to be screened for high cholesterol. Which these are very, very simple tests. They're very inexpensive tests. But what makes the recalculation of cervical cancer death rates and stands out in the discussion is preventable as long as it's detected early and treated appropriately. The low fatality rate amongst European women by and large reflects that fact. African American women, however, die from cervical cancer at rates compared with those in sub-Saharan Africa. One of the major factors behind the discrepancy is that African American patients face inferior access to qualified detection services and follow-up care, the root cause of which is racial discrimination. Another more recent study with patients of advanced stage cervical cancer found a majority received substandard care, and that these patients were more likely to be African American and low income. Now, this is a situation that Hopalong Cassidy, a senator from Louisiana, was talking about at their public so-called charity hospital. People would arrive there and they would just about be dead when they appeared at the hospital. So in other words, that is one of the situations that people face. Let me just get one more story in here from the Reuters news agency as we wrap this up. International account here. The former president now of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe, has been granted immunity. He had resigned from office. A new president is now being sworn in. Granted immunity, assured of safety in Zimbabwe. So he's 93 years old, to die in the country that he helped liberate from the British. Would be protected in his home country as part of a deal on the resignation that he signed. He led the independence since 1980. Now Emerson Mnangagwa is the new designated president. We'll incidentally have a special report on this on many of our units. BR on the World, which is our international news program and political program, later today as we get these productions out here and are in the waiting. We were going to do a special production on disability, but now we felt it was appropriate to put it in on this Thanksgiving communal day, that we bring up these issues that affect working people, whether they work in the fields of America, the factories of America, small town Mississippi, or wherever they work, in Chicago or whatever, and to the diseases like cervical cancer that can be prevented. But discrimination in the medical field is a very broad and a very severe problem, that people do not receive the types of treatments that they should receive, such as the refusal many times of medical staff to devote the funds and the personnel to some things such as PSA testing. And even on that, certain conditions that people are waiting around and not treated right away because they are on Medicaid or Medicare, and thus their conditions worsen. And when they are treated, they are just basically 3/4 of the way dead. Then you get all of these very expensive drugs, chemotherapies applied to them when they have less than 6 months or a year to literally live. And they could be living 5 to 10 years more if they were properly treated. Now, this is one of the things that we need to pay more attention to, and organizations like the NAACP, etc., across the board, needs to do more litigation. That is the answer. And unfortunately, when you talk about litigation, you're on a case-by-case basis. You're basically not in a class most of the time. So it's a very costly but a very and time-consuming process. to sue. But it is one of the things that it's a dual purpose. One, you get into the courts and you have an opportunity for what's called discovery, to discover information, and that information not only in the litigation, but it can be forwarded to the medical associations in the states, and it's publicized, particularly on social media, that these hospital facilities, doctors and what are brought out here. And this is one of the drawbacks now that we have all of these so-called sexual harassment cases out there, that they are overshadowing the real nitty-gritty work, like the tax bill, draconian tax bill, you mentioned it, that would transfer enormous amounts of money to the 1%, and in some cases a 2%. And we have now a situation with Senator Franklin of Minnesota, and we had as one person described, a picture taken at a state fair where everybody was smiling. We'll try to put it up there. And the woman claiming that she was touched inappropriately. Now two additional women come forward claiming that they took pictures with Senator Franklin at some event, a fundraiser I assume, and that he touched them. And they didn't know each other, but they were in this women's course or what the hell they were in. But these kinds of things just obstruct that, because what you happen is you have 40 years ago claims on a Judge Moore in Alabama, and that has basically peaked out. They have started Judge Moore's side to put evidence on the woman that claimed she was 14 years old, was not living where she was, and that is clouded. This is an Alabama issue. The race now is basically, the latest poll out there has a race basically a dead heap, a toss-up. It could be either way. But the news value of it, or the propaganda value, has decreased because everyone knows about it. And we've not seen any more cases against Judge Moore. Now these other cases out there, you have cases in Hollywood. You have a case against Representative John Conyers, the dean of the Senate, and is on the House Judiciary Committee. But he had settled a sexual harassment lawsuit in 2015. But they're investigating these. But the problem there is he's settled it, and it's settled. But when you get into these harassment cases that are 40 years old, 10 years old, and the latest thing in the Huff and Puff Post with the two women, they're anonymous. Well, any fool can come out with an allegation that's anonymous. It has to touch the sunlight. And it will eventually touch the sunlight if there is a hearing. That is change. This whole thing has social implications in employment as to how that will be handled, and changes will be made. No doubt, training in the Congress of the United States, in the corporate places, in television. They will start to make changes in how they recruit people, how people are placed, and such activities, say, as cheerleaders, will more than likely have to go. And they should have went a long time ago. But there are other things out there where women are put out there, as like on Fox News, with short skirts on, etc. That is where the issue needs to be, and not so much on individual cases that were done 40 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, etc. Because they'll not be litigated. They're litigated in the press, and the press has a tendency in the U.S. to turn into a national inquiry, and that gets nowhere. There's nothing concrete about it. As in the case of Senator Franklin, well, if Senator Franklin resigns or removed, what happens then? Well, the governor will appoint someone, and then a special election will be called. And what if the reactionary Republicans win the special election? Well, politically speaking, it's a disaster. And you're dealing with a party whose brand is there. And then you ask the question, is a ban on a woman's right to choose, this is on the abortion label there, Is that worth the sacrifice? Because you could be set back for years. And various other draconian laws, Title 9, making it much harder for universities to deal with sex offenders. You're going to have all these things are happening as long as a Republican brand. And as I was commenting to someone on Facebook, can't remember whom now, that what you're starting to have, you deal with a national brand. DJ Trump is part of the Republican brand. He's not the only one. But what he did, he used a defense lawyer as a tactic. He was very loud. He just said the women were liars, and that was the end of that story right there. He's now sitting in the White House. They're now sitting at home watching him on TV. And this is what starts to happen. These characters like DJ Trump and the various other, now some will be gone, like what happened to old Charlie Rode. He's rode off into the sunset, rose. But at the same time, you'll have others there. They will just, as they say, make adjustments to their various schemes, nefarious schemes. And there will be business as usual on this party. Instead of groping women, they'll be just literally taking their rights away. Because they'd like to touch Lily Ledbetter and anything else, and voter suppression. And those are the kinds of things that this party continues on in their social agenda and various other agendas that they have, like the tax bill. That would be do more harm to women, to working women, than the groping of Senator Franken, period. So in other words, we need to look at issues as they are. Not condoning if any of these things happened. Obviously, they're out of the purview of the legal system. Of course, the women could sue, I suppose, there. But again, there are no witnesses. There's hearsay, we call hearsay testimony, where somebody told their mother, they had a big laugh about it. But you have to look at the timing. Why are these things coming out now? And whom is behind some of these activities? Nonetheless, this ends our broadcast here, Thanksgiving Day 2017, on the 23rd of November. Happy Thanksgiving Day and good day from us at WBRN Radio and on the Boston Red Network. We'll see you officially on Friday Jobber. That's on Friday morning. The week that was on over the weekend here. And on Sunday, the Monday morning quarterback will come up. And there are some games later today, basketball games. We cover the NBA. We are boycotting the NFL. And that is one thing you can do on Thanksgiving Day. A family day. We invite you to do that. Happy